I mean, that's one way to crack copy protection. Today on Ancient DOS Games, I've managed to run across a role-playing game that flew so far under the radar that, even now, it has only one review over on GOG, despite having been available there for about a year and a half as of my making this video. That game being Rings of Zilfin. This is definitely one of the more curious RPGs I've run into for a couple of reasons. The first is that it's very streamlined, with an emphasis on traveling between locations, interacting with the denizens of the world in different ways, and problem-solving different situations depending on what locations you arrive at. The second is that, despite my never having played this game until now, it actually kind of reflects the thoughts I had towards expanding upon my own RPG fighter game that I made many years ago and demonstrated during the second half of ADG episode 303, when I was talking about Shadow Knight. As for if this game is any good though, well, that's kind of a weird question. The thing is, the raw mechanics of the game are fine, but the balance of the game is incredibly out of whack. Even though care and effort was made to provide some semblance of balance to the various tasks and enemies, the reality is, because of how the mechanics of the game work, you can either be underprepared and get slaughtered by everything, or overprepared and nothing is a challenge. There really is no middle ground. Now, as such, your first time playing will probably result in tons of quick deaths, whereas once you understand how to get a foothold on things, all of a sudden, there's no stopping you. Also, make sure you keep a pen and paper handy because, just like with a lot of early RPGs, you're gonna need them. Rings of Zilfin is an early SSI title, originally put out in 1986 for the Apple II and Commodore 64 computers, with ports to the Atari ST and DOS PCs the next year following in 1987, and it's a one-player role-playing game. In fact, I think a big reason why this game is so readily forgotten is because not long after this game came out, or perhaps even during its development, SSI had secured the rights to make games based on the Dungeons & Dragons license, with their first two D&D games, Heroes of the Lance and Pool of Radiance, both releasing one more year later in 1988. It only supports CGA 320x200 4-color graphics and PC speaker sound, and as for its current release state, not only is it still commercial, but amazingly managed to hit digital storefronts in late 2024, being $6 to purchase on either GOG or Steam. The only trick, though, is that this digital re-release has been slightly modified to trivialize the copy protection. Plus, it doesn't come with the manual, and you really do need the manual to make the most of this game, so you'll definitely want to source a replacement of some sort following your purchase. In terms of physical copies, so long as you don't want the DOS version, it won't be too hard to find, but copies will be fairly pricey when you do find them, with typical sale prices being $15 to $25 for loose discs and $50 to $75 for fully boxed copies. But if you do want the DOS version specifically, you're going to have to keep your eyes peeled because they are much more rare than the other ports. Though thankfully, not really any different in price, at least from what I can tell. There may not be a lot of copies of this game floating around, but there's also not a lot of demand for it, so the prices haven't shot through the roof like with some other games. So while the game does have tons of lore in the manual about the various aspects of the world that's been crafted for this game, there's surprisingly little backstory regarding the character you play as. The game takes place on a continent known as Batnik, first occupied by a race known as the Zilfin countless years ago, alongside other races like halflings, dwarves, elves, and of course, humans. Over time, the Zilfin would become fewer and fewer, and ultimately faded into just a memory, at which point evil came to the land in the form of a powerful entity known as Lord Dragos, who proclaimed himself the ultimate ruler, having his thousands of minions take over the land and ensure rule over its three kingdoms with an iron fist. Even though none dared openly oppose Lord Dragos, he was yet missing something required to truly make his takeover complete. The Rings of Zilfin, a pair of artifacts which are useless individually, but when combined are said to provide an ultimate power known only by the Zilfin who created them. Now, in time, Lord Dragos learns where the rings are held, an old Zilfin castle known as Graz, way up in the mountains. And with great effort, Lord Dragos is able to make his way to this long-forgotten castle, beyond its sentries and past its magical barriers, ultimately discovering a small black chest which had been locked away for centuries. He opens the chest and finds a single, solitary ring. To say Lord Dragos was furious would be an understatement, as he raged to the top of the castle and began hurling lightning bolts across the continent in frustration. With no other leads or hints, Lord Dragos would forever be unable to acquire the ultimate power he sought by coming to Batanik. Now, we start the game proper many years following all of this, taking on the role of our young hero, Race, who wakes up one night from a disturbing nightmare about goblins coming to invade his village and capture him. Now, as he's looking outside through the darkness, he sees shadow-like motions in the trees, and hears a voice in his mind urging escape. Evil has indeed come for him. He grabs everything of value as fast as he can, packs it all up, and makes a break for it into the woods, disappearing into the night just before one of Lord Dragos' top wizards makes an appearance, and realizes he missed his chance to capture the boy. But why is Lord Dragos even interested in this young man? Well, it's up to you as the player to find out, building up Raze's skills and taking him on a quest across the three kingdoms, not just to survive, but to aid the people and ultimately put an end to Lord Dragos' evil once and for all. Unique to this DOS port of the game right before you begin playing is a difficulty selection, allowing you to set a difficulty adjustment from 0 to 9, whereby 9 is the easiest and 0 is the hardest. The reason this is missing from the earlier releases of the game is because 0 is the default difficulty of the prior releases, and feedback to those releases clearly showed to the devs that the initial moments of the game are just far too hard if you don't know what you're doing. Now, ironically, all this setting does is change your starting stats, giving you more to work with the higher you set the difficulty number to, and otherwise has no effect on the actual progression of the gameplay. The primary gameplay is separated into two components, traveling and visiting locations. When you're on the map, you'll see a special indicator in the top right corner indicating which cardinal directions you can travel in using the numeric keypad, plus you can use the 5 key on the keypad to go straight back into the location you just left from. You're also only allowed to save while on this map screen, either by pressing S to save and continue or Q to save and quit, with either choice asking if you actually want to save or not. Also keeping in mind that each character you create can only have one save file at a time, and will overwrite previous characters if you give them the same names, thus why you're even allowed to rename the main character in the first place. When you first go to travel, it may be a bit confusing what you're supposed to be doing, but it's actually not that tricky. You start each bout of travel stopped, but are able to walk left and right around the immediate area, picking up mushrooms and herbs if you can see any, or even drinking from ponds or talking to people that you meet along the way. To actually switch between being stationary and moving, you press spacebar, at which point you can use the left and right directions to adjust how fast you're traveling between 3 speeds. Speed 1 is the slowest, but consumes no fatigue points, while Speed 3 is the fastest, but also consumes 4 fatigue points per 5 miles traveled. Generally speaking, once you know what you're doing, you're going to always be traveling at Speed 3. But early game, when you're just starting out or are still getting your footing, it may be safer to choose slower speeds, especially with more stringent difficulties set. The thing is, you want to spend as little time traveling as possible because the more time you spend traveling, the more vulnerable you are to the forces of evil, either as random encounters with goblins or facing down flying enemies when resting for the night, as there's a random chance the first time you attempt to rest for each night that Lord Dragos' dragon birds will be flying overhead. And if they are, you need to make sure you shoot down each and every one of them. If even one dragon bird escapes, more dangerous flying enemies will be summoned. And again, if even one of those flying enemies escape, even more are summoned. Eventually, though, you'll reach your first location, the town of Telbiz. Most friendly locations will either have 3 buildings you can visit, or 2 buildings to visit along with the ability to talk to people passing by, with the services offered in each town or village varying considerably. The general store will always have 4 goods available for purchase and will also pay good money for 4 different kinds of goods. The inn will allow you to buy food as well as buy drinks to hear local tales. The weaponsmith will have weapons and armor for sale, as well as bows and arrows, since yes, your bows can break in this game, at least for the first half anyways. Healers will heal your endurance and fatigue back up to their maximum values. Traders always have 1 item for sale and will be willing to pay very good money for 1 other specific item. Witches can make you physically stronger once you're able to gain strength, and temples to Lord Dragos will have fanatics inside ready to ambush you. But if you defeat them, you'll be able to search the temple for useful things. Sometimes just gold or gems, but other times you'll find things that you can't normally buy, which are essential towards clearing the game. This is where the pen and paper start coming in handy, because early game, you are extremely underprepared for the evils of this world. Now, if you're playing on the original default difficulty, you can survive maybe 1 fight without healing or restocking on supplies, meaning getting a foothold in the first place is kinda almost entirely luck, especially since you can flee from non-random encounters, but you cannot flee from random encounters. Specifically, what you want to be writing down is a map of the world as presented in terms of roads leading to locations, as well as what items you can buy or sell at those locations, because the early game path to riches is trading. Since no locations in the game will buy the same goods they're selling, and since for the most part final sale prices after haggling tend to be higher than purchase prices, finding a loop which gets you a lot of money as fast as possible with a minimum of travel is essential. Plus, it's important to locate where the healers are and to record the costs for their services. The thing is, though, this is where the weird balancing of the game starts to come into play, because once you start raking in the gold from trading goods between locations, you're going to rapidly become much better off than you started, so long as you keep a couple important points in mind about how the stats work. When you press the escape key, you get a summary of your character's stats and inventory. Now, endurance is effectively hit points. Running out will first zero out the endurance value, then losing endurance while it's zeroed out will result in your demise. Fatigue works the same way, whereby if you run out, it first zeroes out, and then losing any more while it's at 0 will kill you. But fatigue is lost as a matter of performing exhausting actions, such as attacking, traveling briskly, walking through marshes without the proper boots, or casting spells once you have magical skills. Strength is represented as 2 numbers, current strength and, in brackets, your maximum potential strength that you can reach with the aid of witches. Strength directly equates to the maximum amount of damage you can do, provided you're wielding a weapon which can also do that much damage. Now, if your strength outpaces your weapon, you simply only deal as much damage as the weapon is capable of, whereas you can't even attempt to wield a weapon requiring greater strength than you currently have. A sword skill is effectively your accuracy when fighting with a melee weapon, which tops out at 66 for whatever reason, but at that level, it's nearly impossible to miss. Magic skill is merely a measure of what levels of spells you can cast, with 33 for level 1 spells, 66 for level 2 spells, and 99 for level 3 spells. Gold is your money, food is consumed at a rate of 1 unit per day, which, to be frank, does not go that fast, and since food is 1 gold a piece in Telbiz near the start of the game, stocking up early ensures you never have to worry about food for the rest of the game. Arrows are your ammo for the bow. Armor directly reduces the damage you take from physical attacks, but has no effect on magic attacks, while your present bow and quantity of bows is listed. While raise is deadly accurate with the bow, rarely ever missing, arrows remain fairly weak throughout the game, dealing about half your strength and damage, and you absolutely do not want to run out of bows or arrows, because if you end up assaulted at night with no bow or arrows to defeat the flying enemies, you're cooked. And yeah, you spend most of the game just traveling, writing down details, and keeping yourself in good shape, occasionally running into events which progress things forwards, such as getting your first bit of magic training out west, or telling the tale of your plight over in the castle to the east, following which you're offered training to raise your potential strength. After making your way through the mountains into the next kingdom, you go through similar steps, with new puzzles to solve and objects to find. Plus, this is where it starts to become important to use the word and offer commands. The word command is used to say a word to someone or something, which you have to type in letter for letter. Now, sometimes this is done to encourage doorways to form through magic spells, but it's also often used to prove friendship with others by typing in the name of someone of their race, other than themselves. And in so doing, they will offer you a gift of some sort along with some advice. This is why it's important to not only write down the names of people you meet in your travels, but also their races. Again, remembering the 4 main races are humans, dwarves, halflings, and elves. The offer command is instead used to give something to someone, and is first used here to offer a pearl to the chaotic sorceress Zera, in exchange for a seed which must be planted immediately in order to properly collect the bark from the resulting tree. Now, seriously, this sequence is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for players, since as soon as you get the seed, you are escorted to the back of Zera's home, and the moment you stop moving, you need to go into your inventory and plant the seed. Otherwise, the sun will rise up, destroy the tree before it has a chance to grow, and force you to go through this whole sequence of bribing Zera again. Which wouldn't be so bad if she wasn't taking 600 endurance worth of magical potshots at you prior to her appearing. And the last thing to mention before we move on is that as you reach the 2/3 mark through the game, you'll get your first taste of a completely new mechanic: dungeon crawling. In this mode, the main game area is split into 2, one for an overhead view of where you are, another for where you enter a room. These sections are a bit cumbersome, especially given that doors have a tendency not to appear until you're right next to them, plus rooms often have multiple exits, and those exits are never really marked that well. But thankfully, these dungeons are easy to map since there's only 2 in the game, both are only 4 floors deep, and the size of each floor is relatively small. Okay, so since this game can be very obtuse to new players, I have a whole bunch of tips and tricks to get you on your feet and get you through the early parts of the game as effortlessly as possible. And keeping in mind, the game can still screw you over pretty hard if you're not staying on top of things. Now, I've already mentioned it's important to find a trade route you like and to rake in the cash through that route ASAP. Well, one trick for making the most of this is to haggle the merchants, as the prices they offer to sell or buy things at aren't always the prices they land on. When you go to buy something, the merchant will give you a price. Now, if you say no, and the merchant is receptive to haggling, you can then input your own price. And as long as it's at or above a certain minimum the merchant will accept, you can perform the purchase. Otherwise, the merchant will just refuse. The thing is, though, there's no limit to how many times you can try this, and the numbers are not random or influenced by anything. So you can keep trying this until you dial in the specific number that the merchant is looking for. The same goes for when you sell something, except you are always expected to give the merchant a price first, and then they will be the ones to counter if they don't like it. And most of the time, the highest price they will accept is a few gold pieces more than what they're willing to offer if they have to tell you their price. Speaking of haggling, when you go to leave some towns, you'll see a beggar in the street ask for some gold, and you can choose how much to give them. If the amount you give them crosses a certain threshold, they'll either provide a hint, or possibly even take you somewhere special if you so desire. Otherwise, they'll just give you a generic message of thanks. Similarly, when you're in a village and have the option to talk to people passing by, there will always be 4 different people in each village you can talk to: a kid, a halfling, an old man, and a dwarf, each of whom only have one thing to say based on which village you're in. Thus, once you've spoken to one of them, you can ignore that person if they walk by again. And you can always ignore the kids because they just say they can't talk to strangers. Ignoring people you don't need to speak to anymore is important because sometimes they'll instead be shapeshifters and a battle will ensue. One thing that's going to be a bit more confusing at first, though, are your endurance and fatigue points, mainly because these are presented without maximums, unlike in most other RPGs, which will tell you what the maximum values are. The thing is, your endurance and fatigue do have maximum values, but every time you exceed these maximums, you set new maximums. Thus, the only time the actual maximum matters is when you go to receive healing, since this restores your endurance and fatigue all the way up to their maximum values. To this end, the best way to increase your maximum endurance and fatigue is to save up the appropriate mushrooms when you can, specifically the Zilfin and Turgan mushrooms, and to consume all of them immediately following a healing session. Speaking of, let's talk a little more about the mushrooms and plants you can acquire. Zilfin mushrooms raise your endurance, Turgan mushrooms raise your fatigue. Simple enough. Fuyan mushrooms are super nutritious, with each providing a full day worth of food. And as far as I can tell, there's not really any benefits to not eating them immediately, since they just add to your food count when you do. Parson mushrooms maximize your sword skills for a single strike, meaning the chance of your next sword attack missing will be negligible. For plants, Mift and Jin are very similar, whereby a single dose of Mift protects you from 1 physical attack, while a single dose of Jin protects you from 5 physical attacks, both of which are incredibly useful early game to keep you alive, especially since later in the game you'll be dealing with a lot more magical attacks. Iola is a poison antidote, seeing as many of the pools you can drink from on your travels are actually toxic and will completely annihilate your stats following, though consuming an Iola plant immediately after making such a mistake will restore your stats back to where they were. The last plant, Perlet, makes your muscles ultra strong for a single strike, allowing your next melee attack to deal 200 points of damage, if it connects. If it doesn't, then the plant is wasted. As such, you almost always want to pair up a Parson with a Perlet when you intend to strike as hard as you can. And yes, I realize that's a lot of P words, and in fact, I'm pretty sure it was done that way on purpose. As for combat, it's not as random as it first appears. In fact, nothing in the game deals random amounts of damage. All damage values are calculated based on how much strength is up against how much armor, or are fixed values for magical spells. This is important to keep in mind because when you face multiple enemies in combat all at once, they may not all have the same stats, meaning certain enemies may go down slower or faster, while some enemies may deal more or less damage if they're using physical attacks. I find the best way to handle things is to prioritize enemies in order of most damage dealing to least damage dealing. You also need to be mindful when you're pressing the S key to strike, because if you don't have the timing right, it's not necessarily going to work. One way to get around this is to both repress and hold the S key down while an attack is playing out, but this doesn't always work either, more specifically with long-running attack sequences. Speaking of spells, you're going to find there's not a lot going for you with the early game magic. Like, sure, one of the level 1 spells prevents you from being robbed when you're leaving a building, but money becomes a non-issue very quickly if you're playing this game right, so it's not really worth the effort to cast said spell. And the only early game spell that's really worth anything is Bazap, since even though it only does 5 damage, it hits all targets. Thus, when dealing with 3 or more enemies at a time, each cast of this spell will deal more total damage than you can do physically until your first strength upgrade. And once you get up to level 2 spells, you'll also gain Udbar, a teleportation spell. And sure, it costs 90 fatigue points to cast, but saves you a complete trip from one point to the next, and is thus incredibly useful for getting around. The last tip I have is to make liberal use of fleeing when you can. Again, you can only flee from non-random encounters, and even then, the chance is low. But you can just keep hammering the F key until it ultimately works. The trick here is that if it's a non-random encounter you haven't yet cleared, you'll want to come back to it later once you're strong enough to survive the battle to investigate what treasures may or may not be found in the area. Because again, while most such encounters only provide gems or gold, there are a few exceptions which will provide items that you need to clear the game. Overall, I get what they were going for with Rings of Zilfin, and what's here plays well enough. The trouble is that the extreme imbalance in the mechanics effectively makes it so that there's really only one path to victory. So despite being called a role-playing game, the reality is there's not a lot of role-play in here, given how linear the progress is and how few options you truly have to play this game's character in your own way. To that end, this is definitely one to try out if you like RPGs, but if that's not a genre you identify with, then this game's more likely to infuriate you than captivate you, even if you enjoy the CGA aesthetics on offer. Although not all aspects of this game are speed sensitive, a few of them are, so you need to set a very low fixed cycles count to ensure everything plays out as intended, with my cycles count set to 300 over the course of this video. Also, while this isn't completely necessary, setting the machine type explicitly to CGA allows the frequent switching over to text mode for your stats to be a little less jarring. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Sorry it's a week late, but tell that to the viruses which invaded my system and the biological warfare which ensued. As you could probably tell from my voice, since it's not all back yet, but getting there. In any case, 2 Saturdays from now, on May 2nd, will be another review, episode 356, and we're going to be looking at the first of many sequels to a game I've already covered on the show, which is not actually all that different from the game it's taking after, let's say for the content and the story. So be sure to stay tuned to see what popular games stayed mostly the same when it moved on to its next incarnation. Thanks for watching, and extra special thanks to everyone pledging support over on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you too can see yourself here and help keep the show going, so please consider joining over at patreon.com/KASICK.